Welcome back to Beyond the Badge. The morning light came in sideways through the tall windows of the Whitmore estate, falling in long golden ribbons across the white rose arrangements, across the crystal champagne flutes, across the pressed linen tablecloths that had been set before sunrise by staff who moved quietly and said very little. It was the kind of morning that looked, from the outside, like a painting. Beautiful, composed, certain. But beauty, as most of us have learned at some point in our lives, does not always tell the truth. Inside that grand hall, in a private dressing room lined with mirrors, a man named Victor Hayes stood before his own reflection and straightened his gold cufflinks for the third time in 10 minutes. His charcoal Italian suit was perfect. His shoes were polished so thoroughly that the ceiling reflected in them. His jaw was set. His eyes were calm. From the outside, Victor Hayes looked like a man who had everything. And perhaps he did. He had the estate. He had the cars, 3 of them, black, lined up in his driveway each morning like loyal soldiers. He had the business empire he had built from almost nothing, real estate developments that stretched across the Southeast, his name on buildings and contracts, and the lips of men who wanted something from him. He had the respect of a city, the envy of his peers, the admiration of people who had never once asked what lived behind his eyes when the room went quiet. He had all of it. And yet, as Victor Hayes stood before that mirror on the morning of his second wedding, there was one thought he could not seem to shake, one thought he had invited into the room himself, as deliberately and as foolishly as a man who opens a window in winter and then wonders why he is cold. He had sent her an invitation, not a reconciliation, not an apology, not an olive branch extended across the wreckage of what had been between them. He had sent Naomi an invitation to watch him win. There are people in this world who enter your life like weather. Sudden, overwhelming, changing everything about the landscape of who you are. Naomi Hayes had been that kind of person, not because she was dramatic or loud or the kind of woman who demanded to be noticed. Quite the opposite. Naomi was the kind of presence that you felt before you fully understood it. A warmth in the room, a steadiness in uncertain moments, a pair of eyes that looked at you as though they could see something in you worth believing in, even when you had given them very little reason to believe. She had grown up in a modest house in Charleston, South Carolina, the youngest of 3 daughters raised by a mother who worked double shifts at a hospital and still managed to have dinner on the table by 7. Her grandmother, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Lena, who wore her silver hair pinned back and kept a handwritten recipe notebook in the kitchen drawer, had been the one to teach Naomi that love was not a feeling you waited for. It was a practice, something you chose, again and again, on the easy days and the hard ones. Naomi had carried that belief into her marriage with Victor Hayes like a lantern into a dark room. She had met him when his company was still new and struggling, when the confidence he wore so easily now had been something he was still learning to put on each morning. She had fallen in love not with his ambition, which was always there, but with the moments between the ambition, the way he laughed when something genuinely surprised him, the way he once stayed up until 2 in the morning helping her look for her cat who had slipped outside in the rain, the way he held her hand in church and didn't seem to notice he was doing it. She had loved that man. She had loved him the way you love something you believe in completely, without a safety net, without conditions, with your whole self offered up like an open hand. And, for a while, he had loved her back. But wealth does something to certain men. It does not corrupt them all. There are men who grow rich and grow kinder, who hold their success gently, who remember where they came from and why it matters. But for some men, money acts like a slow frost. It hardens things that were once soft. It makes the world feel like a competition they must always be winning. It makes other people, even beloved ones, feel like pieces on a board, valued for what they provide rather than who they are. Victor Hayes was, slowly and without fully realizing it, becoming that kind of man. The change came not in one dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small ones. The evenings he stopped asking about her day. The family dinners where he looked at her across the table with an expression she could not quite name. Not unkind exactly, but assessing, measuring. The conversations that began to feel less like connection and more like reports. And underneath all of it, growing louder with each passing month, was the absence. No pregnancy, no child, no heir. In the beginning, they had grieved it together, held each other in the quiet of their bedroom on the nights when hope ran out again. Naomi had cried and Victor had held her, and for a little while the grief had made them closer, the way shared weight sometimes brings two people together. But as the years stretched on and the disappointment accumulated, Victor's grief had curdled into something else. His mother made comments, careful, well-dressed cruelties delivered with a smile at Sunday dinners. His oldest friend, a man named Warren, who had never suffered a day he didn't deserve, had asked once on a golf course in a voice loud enough to carry, "7 years, Vic? You sure the problem isn't on her side?" Victor had said nothing that day, but the question had planted itself somewhere deep, and he had watered it, without meaning to, every month that passed without good news. He stopped reaching for her hand. He came home to silence and offered silence in return. He looked at Naomi, this woman who had prayed over him when he was sick, who had sat with him through the terrifying first years of his business, who had believed in him with the consistency and depth that he had never fully acknowledged, and he began to look at her as though she were the source of everything missing from his life. She felt it. You always feel it when someone you love begins to see you differently. It is not something you can point to or prove. It lives in the pauses, in the way a hand doesn't reach back, in the way a room feels emptier when someone is standing right in front of you. She kept loving him anyway, because that is what she knew how to do, because she had been taught that love was a practice, not a feeling, and she was not willing to stop practicing. But love cannot save a man who has already decided to leave. It was a Thursday evening in November, the kind of cold, gray evening that feels like the sky itself is exhausted, when Victor came home and walked into their bedroom and set his keys down on the dresser with a crack that was too deliberate to be accidental. Naomi was sitting on the edge of the bed folding laundry. She looked up. And in the single second it took to read his face, she understood that something had ended. She just didn't know yet how completely. 7 years, Victor said. His voice was low and even, stripped of everything warm. 7 years, Naomi, and you've given me nothing. Her hands stilled on the shirt she was folding. "I've tried," she said softly. "We've both tried. There are new specialists we haven't seen. There are options we haven't—" "I'm done with options." His voice didn't rise. That was almost worse. The flatness of it, the way it held no room for argument. "My family is embarrassed. My friends have opinions. Do you understand what it costs a man to walk into a room and have people whispering about what his wife can't give him?" Tears filled Naomi's eyes, but she held his gaze. "I'm hurting too, Victor," she said. "Every single month I hurt too. This isn't something I chose. I never wanted—" "You are a curse in my life." The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Naomi did not move. She sat very still with her hands flat on her thighs and her breath coming carefully, the way you breathe when you are trying to hold yourself together by sheer will alone. The lamp on the nightstand cast the same warm light it always did, indifferent to the fact that everything in the room had just changed. "I've spoken to my lawyer. I want a divorce." She slid from the bed to her knees without deciding to. It was not weakness, it was the body's honest response to an unbearable thing, the way the legs simply stop holding when the heart is struck hard enough. "Please," she whispered, "Victor, we made vows. In a church. In front of God and our families. Please don't do this." He took one step back. Just one, but the distance in it was infinite. He said nothing more. And so Naomi rose from the floor, slowly, quietly, with a dignity that cost her more than anyone in that room would ever know, and she began to pack. She folded her clothes with hands that trembled but did not stop. She wrapped a grandmother's china, the pieces she had carried from Charleston, the ones Lena had pressed into her hands on her wedding day, and said, "These go where you go, baby," in newspaper, one by one, setting each piece into the box with the careful tenderness of someone handling something irreplaceable. Which she was. At the door, she stopped. She turned to look at him one last time. This man she had loved across 7 winters. This man she had believed in when belief was the only thing she had left to give. "One day," she said, and her voice was quiet and steady and carried no anger in it, only truth. "You will understand what you are throwing away tonight." Victor stood with his arms crossed and his face closed, and he said nothing. He turned away before she cleared the threshold. And Naomi Hayes walked out into the November dark with one bag on her shoulder and her grandmother's china in a box and a heart that was broken so thoroughly she could feel the edges of every piece. She did not know, walking under those cold streetlights, that she was not walking away from her life. She was walking toward it. Her best friend, Rachel Brooks, opened the door before Naomi could knock, as though she had been waiting, as though some deep and loyal instinct had told her to be ready. She took the box from Naomi's arms and set it gently on the kitchen counter, and then she held her friend in the doorway for a long time without saying a single word. Because some griefs are too large for words, and a true friend knows the difference between the silence that abandons and the silence that holds. Naomi cried that night the way she had not allowed herself to cry in years. Not the quiet, controlled tears she had shed alone in bathrooms and parked cars during the long months of disappointment in her marriage. This was something older and deeper, the kind of crying that comes from the very bottom of a person, that shakes the shoulders and empties the chest and leaves you feeling, when it is finally over, strangely lighter, as though the body knows that some things must be released before there is room for anything new. In the weeks that followed, she moved through her grief slowly and honestly, without trying to rush past it or perform recovery for anyone's benefit. She cooked, because cooking was the thing her hands knew how to do when her mind was too heavy for much else. She took long walks in the early mornings when the streets were quiet. She sat with Rachel in the evenings and let herself be known, fully, messily, without the careful composure she had maintained for so long inside a marriage that had stopped being safe. And one morning, sitting in Rachel's kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, she let herself ask the question she had been swallowing for 7 years. What if I was never the problem? The thought arrived not as an accusation, but as a small, fragile thing, like a seedling pushing up through cracked concrete, uncertain of itself, unsure whether it would be allowed to grow. She made an appointment that same afternoon. The Women's Health Clinic on Harrington Street was quiet on Tuesday mornings. Naomi sat in a chair by the window and watched a sparrow on the ledge outside, working at something small and persistent, and she thought about your grandmother, Lena, who used to say that birds never worried about whether they would find what they needed. They simply kept looking. Dr. Elaine Morrison was a woman of perhaps 55, with steady hands and the particular kind of gentleness that belongs to people who have delivered difficult news enough times to know that how you say something matters as much as what you say. She sat across from Naomi with a file folder open on her knee, and she looked at her, not at the file, not at her notes, but at her. And she said, "Naomi, after a thorough review of everything, I want you to hear this clearly. There is nothing wrong with you. Your reproductive health is completely normal. There is no medical reason on your side that pregnancy should not have been possible." The clock on the wall ticked. The sparrow outside the window flew away. Naomi sat very still. 7 years of being called broken. 7 years of a man's disappointment settling over her like weather she had no choice but to live in. 7 years of quietly, privately, in the darkest hours of sleepless nights, wondering if maybe he was the problem, if maybe she was the problem, if maybe she was, as he had finally said out loud, a curse. And none of it, not one single word of it, had ever been true. She made it to her car before she broke. She sat in the parking lot with the windows fogged from the cold, and she cried until there was nothing left to cry. And then she sat in the emptiness that followed, which was not an absence, but a clearing. The kind of space that opens up inside a person when they finally set down something heavy they have been carrying for so long they forgot it wasn't theirs to carry. After a long while, she straightened in her seat. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror, her face blotched, her eyes swollen, her hair coming loose from where she had pinned it that morning. She looked at herself, and for the first time in a very long time, she did not look away. "You are not what he said you were," she told herself, silently, in the quiet of that fogged-up car in a parking lot in Savannah on a gray Tuesday in January. You never were. She built her life the way her grandmother had built everything, carefully, with love in the work, one day at a time. She started a small catering business out of Rachel's kitchen, using her grandmother's recipes and the instinct for feeding people that had always been native to her. Word spread the way good things spread in a close community, quietly, through trust, one table at a time. Within 6 months, she had more bookings than she could comfortably handle, and she moved into a small commercial kitchen space on Elm Street, and she painted the walls herself on a Saturday morning with the radio playing and Rachel handing her brushes, and both of them laughing in a way Naomi had not laughed in years. It was at a fundraiser dinner for the Savannah Community Arts Foundation, a dinner Naomi had been hired to cater, her tables set with wildflowers and her grandmother's recipes translated into something that made grown men close their eyes when they took the first bite, that she met Daniel Carter. He was not what she would have predicted, if she had been in the habit of predicting. He was not loud or impressive in the way that announces itself. He was a civil engineer, 41 years old, with large, quiet hands and a way of listening that made you feel, when you were talking to him, that what you were saying was the most important thing happening in the room. He found her near the kitchen door, refilling a tray of her grandmother's sweet potato biscuits, and he said, "I have to know what's in these. I've had 3, and I'm about to have a 4th, and I think you should be warned that I have no intention of stopping." She laughed, and it surprised her, that laugh, the way it came up from somewhere real and unguarded. She told him about the recipe, about Lena, about the notebook worn soft at the edges that she kept wrapped in a dish towel in her kitchen drawer. He listened to all of it, not politely, not with the half-attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but with his full self, leaning slightly forward, his eyes on her face. When she finished, he said, "She sounds like someone worth knowing." "She was," Naomi said. "She was the best person I've ever known." "Then so are you," Daniel said simply. "Those things tend to pass." It was not a line. He said it the way you say something you simply believe to be true. She thought about it for 3 days afterward. They were married 11 months later, on a Saturday in June when the air smelled of honeysuckle and the light came through the trees in long, soft columns that turned everything golden. Rachel stood beside her. Daniel's father, a retired school teacher named Edward Carter, who had raised his son alone after his wife passed, and who had done, by every measure, a remarkable job of it, wept openly in the front row and did not seem the least bit embarrassed about it. Daniel held both her hands at the altar and looked at her the way certain men look at certain women, as though they cannot quite believe their luck and have decided to spend the rest of their lives being worthy of it. Naomi had worn a simple dress. No grand production, no performance, just herself, in a garden, in the light, beginning again. 1 year after their wedding, she sat in a hospital room with Daniel's hand wrapped around hers, his thumb moving slowly back and forth across her knuckles, that steady, wordless comfort she had come to know as one of the most reliable things in her world, while Dr. Morrison moved the ultrasound probe with practiced care and studied the monitor with an expression Naomi was trying very hard to read. The room was quiet, except for the machine. Daniel's hand tightened slightly around hers, and then Dr. Morrison smiled, a full, unhurried, genuine smile, and turned the monitor so they could see. "You're pregnant, Naomi." The sound Naomi made was not quite a word. It was something more fundamental than language, a soft, broken exhale that held 7 years of grief and 12 months of healing and every prayer she had ever said in the dark and been unsure anyone was listening to. Daniel pressed his forehead against her temple and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, because some moments are simply too large for language, and the only honest response is to be fully present inside them. And then Dr. Morrison said, "I need you both to look at this." She pointed to the screen. "There are 3 heartbeats." The silence that followed was different from any silence Naomi had ever sat inside. It was full, completely, overwhelmingly full. 3 heartbeats, 3 lives already beginning, 3 small proofs flickering on a monitor in a quiet hospital room in Savannah, Georgia, that she had never been broken, that she had never been a curse, that the only thing ever wrong with the story of Naomi Hayes was the man who had been given the privilege of writing it with her and had chosen, in his pride and his blindness, to put down the pen. She cried. Daniel cried. Dr. Morrison handed them both tissues and gave them the particular gift of a professional who knows when to stop talking. 3 sons were born the following spring, on a Tuesday when the cherry trees outside the hospital were in full bloom, their petals drifting past the window of Naomi's room like something out of a dream. She held them one by one in the hours after they arrived. Each tiny face, each miniature fist, each set of eyes still adjusting to the brightness of a world they had only just entered, and she felt something she had no complete word for. Not just happiness, something larger than happiness, something that felt like arrival. The invitation had arrived in a cream-colored envelope, hand-delivered to her business address. Naomi had stood in her kitchen and held it for a long moment before opening it. She had recognized the handwriting, that precise architectural script Victor had always used, the handwriting of a man who believed that even small things should project control. She read it once, then she set it on the counter and went to check on the boys who were in the backyard with Daniel and a sprinkler and an enthusiasm for water that seemed to have no upper limit. She stood at the kitchen window and watched her husband chase 3 laughing boys through the spray, his shirt soaked through, his face open and unguarded, and full of a joy so uncomplicated it was almost painful to look at. She thought about what Victor had intended by sending the invitation. She understood it perfectly. He wanted her to arrive poor and diminished and alone, to sit in the back of a room full of his success and understand, in her bones, that she had lost, that her life after him had been nothing, that his decision to discard her had been correct, and she had simply been too weak to see it. He wanted to win. Naomi set down her coffee cup. She looked out the window at her family in the golden afternoon light. She thought about her grandmother Lena, who used to say, "Baby, you don't owe anyone your suffering, but sometimes the truth has a way of showing up on its own, and all you have to do is let it." She made one phone call that evening, to Rachel. I'm going, she said. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll come with you. No, Naomi said gently. I need to do this one alone. Well, she paused. Not entirely alone. The morning of Victor's wedding was everything October in Savannah knows how to be. The light amber and generous, the air carrying the first real edge of autumn, the old oak trees along the drive trailing their Spanish moss like the hems of long, unhurried gowns. Victor stood on the front steps of the Whitmore estate, receiving early guests, his smile precisely calibrated, his suit impeccable. Around him, the wedding moved forward with the efficiency of something expensive and well-planned. Staff moved quietly, flowers gleamed, the string quartet in the corner of the garden played something classical and unobtrusive. He had told himself he was not watching for her, but when his assistant Marcus appeared at his elbow with that particular expression, the one that indicated something unexpected was unfolding, Victor found that he had already turned toward the long drive before Marcus opened his mouth. "Sir," Marcus said carefully, "she's here." Victor looked. The car came slowly up the drive, a silver Rolls-Royce Ghost, moving with the unhurried certainty of something that has never once needed to announce itself. It came to a stop at the bottom of the entrance steps, and for a moment, nothing happened. And the quiet that settled over the courtyard was the quiet of people who understand instinctively that they are about to witness something. The door opened. Naomi Carter stepped out. She was wearing a dress the color of deep ivory, warm and assured, neither trying to compete nor trying to diminish, simply present in the way that genuine elegance is always simply present. Her grandmother's pearls at her throat, her hair arranged with the kind of effortlessness that takes real confidence to achieve. On her face, and this was the thing that Victor would find himself returning to later, in quieter and more honest hours, no triumph, no performance, no cruelty. Only the expression of a woman who knows exactly who she is. Daniel stepped out behind her, steady, unhurried, his hand extended back toward the car with the easy attentiveness of a man who is always thinking about the people he loves. 3 small boys emerged one at a time, each one looking around at the world with the wide-eyed curiosity of children who have been raised in a home where curiosity is welcomed. 3 identical faces, 3 little suits, 3 sets of shoes that had been polished that morning by a father who believed the small things mattered. The courtyard had gone very still. Victor stood on the steps above and watched. He watched Daniel take Naomi's hand, not possessively, not performatively, but with the uncomplicated ease of 2 people who have been reaching for each other long enough that it has become as natural as breathing. He watched one of the boys tug at Naomi's skirt and point at something in the garden, a bird perhaps, or a flower, or simply some small ordinary thing made wonderful by young eyes, and he watched Naomi crouch down to his level without a second thought, her dress pooling around her on the cobblestones, her face turned toward her son with an attention so complete and so warm that it was visible from 30 feet away. He watched her rise. He watched her say something to Daniel that made him smile. And then she looked up, and her eyes found him. It was not an accident. She had known where he was. She looked at him for a long moment, across the cobblestones and the white roses and the distance he had placed between them with his choices, and she held his gaze without flinching and without performing and without giving him a single thing he could call victory. What she gave him instead was something he had not prepared for. She looked at him with compassion. Not pity, not anger recycled into something that looked like forgiveness but still carried its teeth. Genuine, quiet, costly compassion, the kind that can only be extended by someone who has passed through enough pain to understand that bitterness is a prison, and she had chosen, deliberately and at great personal cost, to leave the door of that prison open and walk out. Then she turned to Daniel. She gathered her 3 boys around her with the gentle efficiency of a woman who has done this 10,000 times and loves it every one. She took her husband's arm, and she walked back to the car. Unhurried, unbothered, unbowed. She did not stay for the wedding. She had not come to attend it. She had come, and perhaps she understood this only now in the leaving, to close a door that had been left open far too long, to let herself be seen fully and truly by the man who had once told her she was nothing. Not to punish him, not to prove anything that required his acknowledgement, only to let the truth stand in the light for a moment, only to let it breathe. The Rolls-Royce moved slowly back down the long drive, between the old oaks with their trailing moss, through the amber October light, and away. Victor watched it until it was gone. Around him, the wedding continued. Guests talked, the quartet played, someone laughed near the champagne table. And Victor Hayes stood on the steps of the most expensive day of his life and felt, in the place where certainty used to live, a silence so complete and so honest that he had nowhere left to hide from it. He had held gold in his hands. He had set it down because he was too proud to understand what he was holding, and now the gold was gone, and the pride was all that remained. And pride, as anyone who has ever been left with nothing but pride will tell you, is a very cold thing to come home to. Naomi Carter drove home through the October streets of Savannah with Daniel's hand resting on the console between them and 3 small boys asleep in their car seats in the back, their faces slack with the peaceful unconsciousness of children who have never once doubted that they are loved. She thought about her grandmother Lena, about a handwritten notebook in a kitchen drawer, about the woman who had told her all those years ago that love was not a feeling you waited for, but a practice you chose. She had chosen it, again and again, even when the choosing was hard. She had chosen it when it was not returned. She had set it down when the time came. She had picked it back up, carefully, and offered it to someone who knew what to do with it. She looked out the window at the old trees lining the road, their branches just beginning to turn, the light coming through them in pieces, golden and intermittent, and beautiful. She was not a woman who had survived. She was a woman who had arrived. To anyone watching this who has ever been told they are the problem, who has carried the weight of someone else's inadequacy as though it were your own, hear this. The truth does not need your permission to exist. It does not need to be believed by the person who denied it. It does not need an audience or an occasion or a silver Rolls-Royce, though sometimes, in the particular grace of things, it gets all 3. You are not what was said about you in the hardest rooms. You are not the verdict of someone who could not afford to know your worth. You are defined by what you chose to do in the silence after. And if you are in that silence right now, if you are in the November dark with one bag and a broken heart and a future you cannot yet see, please hear this. Keep walking. The light is further than it looks, but it is there. And it was always meant for you. If this story reached something inside you, then you already know why you're here. Subscribe to Beyond the Badge. This is a place built for the stories that remind you who you are, the quiet heroism, the unrecognized sacrifice, the love that holds on past all reason, the spirit that rises when everything says it should not. Hit that subscribe button, turn on your notifications, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And remember, every story we tell here is told for one reason. Because you deserve to be reminded as often as it takes that strength is quiet, love is real, and the most powerful thing you will ever do is refuse to stop believing in your own worth. We'll see you in the next story, right here, Beyond the Badge.